Today, we continue from yesterday with the second psalm. Even before I begin, I'll acknowledge that in the Talmud, in Brachot 10a, there is a description of Psalm 1 and Psalm 2 being one psalm, and in that regard, saying that these first two psalms are the introduction to psalms. In part, that linking of Psalm 1 and 2 is because Psalm 1 begins with the word ashrei, or happy, content, and as we'll see when we analyze this morning's psalm, ashrei will appear in the last sentence. So in that sense, there's a quality of an envelope. The other thing that sets these two psalms apart from Psalm 3, which we'll study tomorrow, is Psalm 3 begins a Psalm of David, which is true of most of the first 40 psalms. So in contrast, Psalm 1 and 2 is not identified explicitly with David, and therefore are put together. At the same time, these two psalms are very different in theme. Psalm 1 is sometimes called a door into Psalms, hence our question yesterday, which was, why do the Psalms begin with Psalm 1? And Psalm 2, which is also called a royal psalm. It's a psalm that focuses on the king. I'm going to read it in English. I'm then going to talk about the structure poetically of the psalm, and then we'll focus on the ambiguity. Because again, what makes a poem is that every word counts. That enables, in some cases, double entendres or more than one meaning. And that poems often have a order, a structure to reinforce a theme. And so, Psalm 2, Royal Psalm. Why are the nations in an uproar? Why do the people mutter in vain? The rulers of the earth stand up and take counsel together against Adonai and against the Anointed One. Let us remove their bands and cast away from us their cords. The one who sits in heaven will laugh. My master will mock them. Then will God speak to them in wrath and affright them in sore displeasure. Quote, truly it is I that have established my rule upon Zion, my holy mountain. Unquote. I shall tell of the decree. Adonai said to me, you are my child. This day did I beget you. Ask of me, and I will give nations as your estate and your holdings, the ends of the earth. You shall smash them with a rod of iron, like a potter's jar. You will dash them in pieces. And now, O you rulers, be mindful, be admonished, you judges of the earth. Serve Adonai with fear and rejoice with trembling. With purity be armed, lest God rage and you perish in the way when suddenly wrath is kindled. Happy are all they that take refuge in God. So next, let me point out the structure. There are 12 verses that are broken into 4 parts. So every 3 verses forms a unit. And the nature of the first 2 units are 2 sentences and then a quote. And the opening question will be, who's speaking? It seems to be that there is a king speaking. Why are the nations in an uproar? And why do the people mutter in vain? The rulers of the earth stand up and take counsel together against Adonai and against the Anointed One. So in that regard, it could be as if it's the king speaking. The Anointed One in Hebrew, Mishicho, is the same word that is Messiah, the one who's anointed by oil being poured. Later commentators might view this more messianically, but in its context, it may be a king speaking in a particular time. Some, like Rashi, suggest that this is King David speaking just after he was anointed, when the Philistines have threatened to attack him, which you can find in 1 Samuel chapter 5, verse 17. And so that King David, now anointed, quotes and says, "Let us remove their bands and cast away from us their cords." Again, here too, ambiguity as to who is being quoted. It seems to be these foreign kings. Also note, the rulers of the earth stand up and take counsel. There's a quality of, if you will, grandiosity. I mean, this is a small little kingdom, the kingdom of Israel. And yet, it's as if God is looking on Israel as the center. And even though we're only talking about the Philistines, it's as if all the rulers of the earth are standing and opposing God and God's anointed one. And so the second stanza, likewise, is two statements and then a quote. What I find worthy of comment is how anthropomorphically, or the fancy term is anthropopathically, which means human emotion, is ascribed to God. The one who sits in heaven will laugh. My master will mock them. That's true for all of Torah, but it's a very different image of God than the distant, perfect being. This is a God who's emotional, who's laughing and mocking, which again makes me smile to see God in these personal terms, which is also a way to find great comfort. In a much later time, God in the Hasidic tradition would be referred to as Tata, as Father, a way of creating an intimacy. And that same quality of intimacy is conveyed in these emotional descriptions of God in human-like ways. Then God will speak to them in wrath and affright them in sore displeasure. Again, God is emotional. God is angry. And now it's God who speaks. Truly, it is I that have established my rule upon Zion, my holy mountain. I again pause to acknowledge this word Zion, in Hebrew Tzion, and a reminder where we Jews are connected to Israel and where Zionism comes from. That is where God's temple is. That is the symbol of God's presence in midst the Jewish people. And God is asserting, that is, if you will, my abode. Now, the third unit. And the third unit, here the speaker is the king, but only an introductory phrase, and then he's quoting God. I shall tell of the decree, Adonai said to me, you are my child. This day I beget you. This quality again of intimacy. Ask of me, speaking to Israel, and I will give nations as your estate and your holdings the ends of the earth. The other line elsewhere in the Psalms, and that is, the whole earth is the Lord's. God's the creator. And so God says, it's all mine. Just ask me what you want and I'll give it to you. And then offering words of strength to the king. You shall smash them with a rod of iron. And this word rod, shevet, is also a ruler's mace. So it's the iron mace that a ruler would hold. So there's the image that you'll use your iron rod and you'll smash them as if they were from clay. Like a potter's jar, you will dash them in pieces. And now the final stanza. And here is the poetry of the poet. Namely, it's not clear, and I'll begin to read in a moment, who the speaker is. There are four possibilities, which will lead to four different ways of understanding this closing three verses. The four possibilities, it could be the original speaker, It could be the audience responding. It could be an earthly king, meaning the original speaker may have just been a narrator, or it could be God speaking in the third person. Likewise, it's ambiguous who the audience is. Is this audience other kings, which would create an envelope because in the beginning, the audience or the focus is other kings? Is this instead, these last three verses, the people of Israel, including us, the reader? Or are these last verses referring to the Israel king? So let me read them, and that'll be the focus for me to unpack. And now, O you rulers, be mindful. Be admonished, you judges of the earth. Ivdu et Hashem b'yira. Serve God with awe, with fear. V'gilu b're'idah. And rejoice with trembling, which is again paradoxical, right? Rejoice and be in trembling. And the last verse, Nashku var. This translation is that of Professor Alter. His translation, he's a professor at Berkeley. With purity be armed. The neshek is an armament, and bar, like the Hebrew word bor, could be purity. But other translations, nishku can also be a kiss, and bar could be ground, which could be, as it's translated in the JPS, the Jewish Publication Society, what does it mean to kiss the ground? It means pay homage. You know, you bend down, you kiss the ground, you pay homage. JPS continues in good faith. So that last verse now, with purity be armed, lest God rage and you perish in the way when suddenly wrath is kindled. Ashrei, happy, kol chosevo, are all that take refuge in God. And in that regard, there's a colon, there's kind of a, again, there's no punctuation in the original psalm. So punctuation is also a commentary. This Ashrei is kind of a surprise, because until now, it has been kind of a back and forth between a declaration and a quote. And here, this is almost like a closing shout, or the chorus, having listened to that back and forth, collectively saying, Ashrei, happy are those who take refuge in God. Because in some degree, that is also the message, that God is the source of the earth, that God is the source of power, and that our obedience to God will allow for God to be our source of strength over our enemies. The word Ashrei occurs in 19 Psalms, but it's even more remarkable that it again is the opening word, and here in the closing phrase, the opening word of the second Psalm. So back to yesterday's sharing, the goal of Psalms is to have conversation with God. There are 150 Psalms, and those conversations are in the form of poetry. They represent the whole palette, the whole array of different kinds of human emotion. The opening, what was chosen as the opening, are two Psalms that don't mention King David by name. They are two Psalms that are on one hand very different from each other. Psalm 1, yesterday's reading, distinguished a happy person who is able to avoid the ways, the counsel, the conversation with the wicked. Acknowledge that the person who is so righteous through being linked through Torah is grounded deeply. And those roots that come through the study of Torah allow for a quality of sustenance so that the leaves are green, don't wither. The fruit is born, but the wicked are like chaff blown away. And so the opening psalm emphasizes how there is danger in the world, the danger of the wicked, their seductive counsel, and that the antidote, the shield, the protection is righteousness. That's the goal. But the shield itself is Torah. And through study, one is protected. And then those who are wicked will not have a leg to stand on when there is judgment, with the ambiguity of whether that judgment is by the nation, by God, or by both. In Psalm 2, our reading for today, the shift is to power, both God's power and the power of the nation, the king, saying that we have enemies, again, that the world is dangerous, now from the point of view of the king. But God is listening, God is watching, and God has an anointed one. This is the king that God has chosen in God's holy place, Jerusalem, the Temple, Mount Zion. And God is emotionally engaged and will protect and enable the victory. And yet, the ambiguity of the closing lines, because these are statements of people about God. Those are statements in terms of God's power and protective quality of faith. And therefore, the closing three verses where God could be the speaker of Atam Malachim, and now you rulers, is one possibility. But the other is, again, in that remarkable verse, serve Adonai beyira, with awe, fear, and rejoice with trembling, that here it's the king talking to the people or the original speaker, saying, which goes back to the first psalm, that for us to have a relationship of God as our source of strength, we need to be serving God and doing so with yira, which again is fear, but it's also awe, or to say it differently, awesome is also awful. They both are awe, the good and the bad. The sense of God's might, in some cases, might overwhelm us with our own creatureliness by how bad things are. And yet, the response, even in bad times, needs to be a quality of celebration that there is a God, hence rejoice with that assurance, even with trembling, returning to this notion of recognizing God's power, or the power even in nature. And then verse 12, so the response and acknowledging the power and the danger is, on one hand, trust in God, with purity be armed, meaning with faith in God, we are armed, because God's rage and wrath are present and will be there for our protection. And then that closing line, ashrei, happy or content. And again, that inner quality, ko chose vo, all who take refuge, bo, in him, which I translate here in God. And so to pull these two together, and then I will look for some of your reactions. And the thing I'd like you particularly to focus in on is anything that comes to your mind. But what I'd really like, because it's the one verse I knew well before I studied this verse closely, and that's verse 11, and that is, serve God with awe, rejoice with trembling. It's a verse that seems to be relevant for this moment of coronavirus. I'd like your reactions. So with that, reactions, we have about 8 minutes for reactions. You can unmute yourself by hitting your space bar or by clicking the red arrow and then remute yourself. Again, I am eager to gain your thoughts as we have studied this together. And I'm delighted to see that people have returned after yesterday's challenges. Thank you for being part of the conversation again today. So who would like to, let's again, for purposes of focus, what do you do with verse 11? Serve Adonai with fear and rejoice with trembling. How does that verse resonate? What problems might you have? In what ways is it perhaps helpful? Any thoughts?
I have one.
Oh, Dahlia, good to see you.
Good morning, everybody. Sorry, was a little late. I had to make my coffee, but you know, the word fear, I agree with you. It's more awe when you see something that you are inspired by or that makes sense. Your heart rate increases. It's not fear like fear of, you know, something bad is going to happen to you, like fear of the coronavirus. It's more fear of something that is all powerful, that is all there. And for me, and obviously this is a very famous verse or something like it, but it means to be aware that there is something that is greater than us, that there is something out there that is beyond us.
Yeah.
That we are part of, and yet it's not just us here, that this Hashem is here for us to hold on to if we wish to, if we want to, and rejoice with trembling mean being grateful that we are graced, if you will, to acknowledge God's presence in our lives and be aware of God's presence in our lives. And I think for me, that's what it means, that to have that mindfulness of Hashem. I mean, I don't have it all the time. I wish I did, but life gets in the way. But that sense of awe, that sense of, wow, you know, there is something bigger here. And I find that very comforting when I'm going through my own personal anxieties and fears. And now when the world is going through this, that for me, you know, just seeing you and Amy, you know, on Shabbat and reading Tehillim has been a great calming presence, if you will. So that's what it means to me.
Good. Let me react to it first by reframing what you shared, Dahlia. And that is, Dahlia would say, for me, the focus is this word yirah, this in the middle of the verse, that basically emphasizes the quality of wonder, of awe, in the sense of being part of something much larger, something even beautiful. And that sense of wonder is the fuel for feeling connected, and by being connected, safe in the world. So two other associations. There's another famous verse. It's Psalm 100, verse 2. It's actually in our sanctuary, engraved in our Jerusalem stone. And that's, Ivdu et Hashem besimcha, serve God with joy, bo lefanav bernana, come before God with rejoicing. So the Ivdu and the Ivdu are the two places in Psalms, and they are kind of a counterpoint, and that they're here, the emphasis is on awe, and there it's on rejoicing. The other piece, though, two other associations, and that's Abraham Joshua Heschel, the great theologian, the poet of our tradition, said that what modern persons lack is wonder, that the sense that our ability to speak and to be heard, if we pause to think about it, would be a wow. And religion's goal is to cultivate wow, awareness. Because with wow awareness, we just live with a quality of gratitude and praise that's different when you're not aware of the wow. And that's, I think, what you're emphasizing, Dahlia, in your Yira focus. Anybody else want to comment on this verse? We have time for like another comment, and then I'll react and pull it together for today. Cliff, thank you.
Well, it's actually Sarah, but
Sarah, thank you. All right, go ahead, Sarah.
what brought to mind with me was I don't get the phrase right, but that whole thing where God was not in the earthquake or the fire or the weather. It's the small, still voice. So it's like you see the trembling, you see the awe and all the huge manifestations, but God's not there. He's in that small voice that I can take refuge in.
So let me react to that wonderful association, Sarah, on two counts. One, it brings us to Mount Sinai, where literally the people were quaking or trembling. The word in there used was charidim, and that's where the word Quakers comes from, like in American religious life, because at Mount Sinai, in God's presence, people were trembling. So in that regard, for Sarah, there's the association of the wonder of experiencing God that leads to a quality of trembling, but it can be also this high, literally, in that sense, rejoicing as a high in terms of encounter of God. And at the two closing verses, verse 10 is, remember there is a judge ultimately. And then verses 11 and 12 are the response. And that is, be in wonder, be in awe, to know that we have a world with a creator. And be humble in response and know that God is emotionally present. And going back to the opening, Ashrei, your own sense of equilibrium, Ashrei, your own sense of contentment and happiness, comes with trust in God. Psalm 27, which we recite in the 30 days of Elul, closes with Kaveh al Adonai, hope in God, Chazak v'yametz libecha, hope and be courage, trust in God. So I'll pull it together. Psalm 1 and 2 are complementary, though quite different. One focuses on more clearly what creates a contented individual, which is a shield of Torah study to draw close to God, to be safe from evil counsel. Psalm 2 says also it's a dangerous world where there are kings who would attack. It could also be viewed metaphorically, forces that would attack. And ultimately saying, despite that, what one has to feel is an assurance that comes with wonder and more a response of service. Ivdu, service to God, prayer to God, that will also lead to contentment. Tomorrow we'll look at chapter 3, which some in the Talmud and Brachot say is actually the first psalm, and that it will begin with a psalm of David. And we'll see how that shifts from Psalm 1 and 2 to Psalm 3. I thank all of you for participating, but before we say goodbye, Helene Coulter is saying Kaddish. If there's anybody else among us who is observing a yurtzeit or in mourning, study leads to the opportunity to say Kaddish, and for us the mitzvah of answering Amen. 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 Yehi Shmei Rabba Mevorach. Amen. Almighty. Riku. Amen. 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 We have